Hey guys, Lucas Sacco here. Before we get into the video, I did want to give a quick shout out to the sponsor, Dueling Guard. They have mats, deck boxes, bags, everything you can think of for TCG apparel. Check them out in the description box down below and use code Sacco for 5% off. Hey guys, Lucas Sacco here. Today I am bringing you guys a tier list of what I currently think are the best decks in the format that we are currently in, which is November of 2024. This will be for the remote YCS. There aren't really any other YCSs leading up with this current format besides the Bologna as well as the remote YCS, but I feel like it was a good time to do a tier list that way I can just share my opinions over the current format, because I actually think this format is a lot better than people are giving it credit for. We have a much lower turnout when it comes to regionals and representation recently. I don't really know why that is. Could just be because the game is expensive right now. That would be my assumption about it. But I think the game is actually in a really good state, and so I did want to share my thoughts on the format. So starting off with Melodious, this is a deck that saw a little bit of play when the format force shifted over. However, I don't think I'd play this deck now just because it does have major consistency issues. If you look at how many starters the deck really has, it's not that many, and losing the prosperities from the ban list that happened a couple weeks ago, this deck just gets a little bit worse with that. I put it down here in tier 3, not because of the deck's power or ceiling, just because the deck is a little bit inconsistent. This is going to be pure Snake Eye with the Azumina cards. This deck, I think, is still a tier 1 contender. It's not something that I would personally play just because I think the deck does have some major flaws, but the deck has a very high ceiling. It has different pros and cons, like with Fire King, about which one you're wanting to play. The main deal here is that this deck can just play an abundant amount of hand traps. So you can still play Impulse in this deck, which is by far the best hand trap of the format, as well as playing like an additional 15 hand traps with 3 Impulse, and that still gives you a little bit of room if you want to play like a cross out or something, or a called by in your deck. So yeah, Snake Eye is still really high up on the tier list. Branded, unfortunately, I do really like this branded deck, but right now we're gonna have to leave this in our binder. The deck is unplayable in my opinion. You're going into most matchups knowing that your opponent not only has 3 Ash Blossoms in their deck, because that's mandatory right now, but they also have 3 Impulse, right? 3 Impulse is super scary. And with that, people are also playing countermeasures to try to deal with like graveyard interactions, things like Call by the Grave, things like DD Crow, and both of those do stop the puppet lock that this deck provides. So it's a little bit scary there, and I just personally would not play this deck right now. The next thing is Centurion. I actually really like this deck. I think this deck has some issues when it comes to playing against rogue decks. So like mid-range decks that usually have like a good amount of follow-up provided to them. They may not have the highest ceiling, but they have good follow-up, good pushes. I think this deck has like major struggles with, because if you can't hand trap them to death or force them onto like one interaction, Centurion does feel like a very, very poor deck. However, it plays best into like all of the floodgate hand traps, and by that I mean like Parelia, Shifter, Fuwalos, even Droll. Like Centurion plays through all of those decks very, very well, or all those hand traps very, very well. And so this deck can easily make it through a Swiss of a YCS, just because you're not going to lose as many of those defaulted games because your opponent drew the floodgate hand traps. I think that's the reason that Pac played this for the previous YCS at Niagara, and he did very, very well. He lost in top 16 to unfortunate circumstances with bricking, but I think the deck has been improved upon. People are moving prosperities in the main deck of this deck. Some of them are even cutting the Bestials, although most aren't. But the deck can get modified to help it out a little bit when it comes to consistency. And I think this deck is honestly a very good choice for any sort of YCS type event to where there's a Swiss and a top cut. For a regional, I wouldn't play this just because going into a regional, you are trying to get first, right? You're trying to get top 4, trying to get top 8. You don't really care about getting into the top 32, top 48 section unless you're just trying to get your invite. But you should really be focusing on trying to get into the top 8, right? That's where the prizing is. And playing a deck that has kind of like a low ceiling but very consistent output is probably not the best. There's probably a better deck that you can play in that spot. The next thing is going to be the Chimera Fiendsmith deck. I don't really like this deck. I think this deck is pretty poor into a lot of the floodgate hand traps. So Droll is really good versus this deck. Fuwalos is really good versus this deck. Shifter is even pretty good versus this deck. I will say that Parelia, you can give them 0 draws a lot of the time. Sometimes it's 1 draw, sometimes it's 2 maximum, but it's usually like 1 if that. So that's one thing the deck has going for it. However, if this deck goes second, it feels like you lose almost every single game that you go second. And it's just not like me playing the deck poorly. I've watched a lot of people play the deck, and it just seems like it doesn't do what it needs to going second, and that's the reason that I would never play this deck in this current format. I hate Senpai. I hate Senpai religiously. This deck is so cringe. Every person that plays this deck just makes a conscious decision that they're just going to shuffle their deck and hope they win. It doesn't really matter about the sequence they do things. Like, it's so obvious, like, how you're supposed to sequence your cards. You're going to look at your hand and go, ah, man, I hope that it is a good draw so I can win the game. Because it's just luck. Realistically, it's just luck. I think this deck is something to prepare for, though. It plays Shifter, it plays Fuwalos, it plays Parelia, it plays these Floodgate hand traps that we're scared of. Not to mention, if they do open, like Ash Blossom and Impulse, it's going to make your board a lot easier for them to break with a single board break or even double engine card. I would prepare for Tenpai, but I would never play this deck. This deck is so terrible, and you have no control over your matches. Fire King Snake Eye. So I think this deck is by far the best deck of the format. It's definitely on par with the Azumina deck. It's like this for me. Like, the Fire King deck is better than the Snake Eye deck. However, they're both still tier 1. I don't really like doing the whole like tier 0, tier 0.5 thing in this format because it's not, right? You can play Fire King and lose to Fiendsmith like every game. It's not like it's a super unfair differentiable, but Fire King does have situations that it can play out of that no other deck can. Like, getting into grind games where there's floodgates going, Fire King surpasses every other deck on this list when it comes to playing through those, right? Having Kieran in circulation, having Island every turn, even having just Olkanix as a body that floats around is really, really good for the deck. And that's why I think that Fire King is one of the best decks of the format, being able to play 15 hand traps as well as having like a very resilient engine, and then still having the consistency to back it up, right? I think this deck is on 16 starters, and then you can play anywhere from 40 to 43, 44 cards even. This deck is very, very powerful. Next thing is Rescue Ace. I actually think this deck is really good right now. With the Azumina cards, Cam Neal's been playing this past couple events. I know that Aditya Zerab played this at Dallas, but I think this deck's really cool. The good thing about this deck is that it has one of those really, really neat matchups into Centurion. So, like, what I mean by that is that it is one of those mid-range decks that even if you hand trap them a couple times, they're going to end with like 1 or 2 disruptions, right? Because they're going to draw into those bad trap cards in their deck, and that's just going to obliterate your opponent. Having just interactions against that deck is really good. Not to mention, the Rescue Ace deck is already good at going second. That was like one of the best things. I think it was like December of last year, maybe November or October, but the indie of last year that Santoli won. The reason that Rescue Ace was a very, very good pick for that event is because the deck just had such a high ceiling going second. Preventer is one of the most insane cards I have ever read, and the fact that it can be used so aggressively to break a board is insane. The only thing that I think is pushing Rescue Ace down right now from being one of the best decks in the format is that it does feel like it kind of has a poor Tenpai matchup. You don't have like a good backup plan like the Fire King deck does, or the Snake Eye deck, to where you can just make a Fuko bird. If you can make that bird, they lose the game. Some people are playing Santa Claus and Kaijus in their deck, but those people are really bad. The Rescue Ace deck, to be honest, I would really consider playing this for upcoming events, just because it does have a good matchup through all the Floodgate hand traps as well. Like Parelia, they're going to get 1, maybe 2 draws. You can play around it even. Like, if they Parelia, you can change your line of play to avoid it. They Fuwalos you can give them 1 draw and set 4 cards from deck. Or if you have the emergency in your hand, you can give them 0 draws and set 4 cards from deck. Absolutely insane there. But yeah, I value this deck very, very highly on the tier list. Next thing is Labyrinth. I think this deck is terrible. I don't think this deck will ever see a higher tier than it has seen in the past. I think the deck will only continue to get worse. Even with getting Impulse into the format, which is like a very high ceiling trap card, which is actually going to help the deck a little bit. It's just going to hurt the deck even more with your opponent having Impulse in their deck, because you wanted to like literally throw your deck in the garbage every single time you got Ash Blossom in this deck, and now the fact that they can Impulse you is even worse, right? Because it's not even a monster effect now, so they can respond to things. So this deck is not great. Next thing would be Voiceless Voice. Voiceless Voice is something that I've seen people play more and more as they like go into the format, just because it has like a good Fuwalos like matchup, I guess. This deck is so bad. Like, it's terrible. If you lose the die roll, the game's done. Like, you have to go an entire event with either winning die rolls or playing against Tempai or, like, Runic Stun. That's, like, where this deck has its moments, I guess, is versus crap decks like Tempai and Runic Stun. But besides that, if this deck plays against Fire King, like, Fire King obliterates this deck every time. Memento. I love Memento. This is one of my favorite decks. If you've looked at my channel, you see I've posted a lot of videos about this deck. I think this deck has a very high ceiling. I think this deck can play through infinite hand traps. It plays through Fuwalos great. It plays through Parelia. The only issue that I see with this deck is that there is no counterplay to Shifter. Zero. If you get Shifter, all of your engine cards do literally nothing. You literally go like SP pass. And that's like in a good hand, you know? So I really wouldn't play this deck right now. Until Shifter gets banned or Tempai gets rotated out of the format, I would really not consider playing Memento at all. I will say that going into the next format, we're going to be seeing Malice and Ryzel. Both of those decks do have the ability to play Shifter, so Memento is going to be put on the back burner just for quite a while. It's not going to have that many good formats coming up. I'd say maybe around March or June we could see this deck resurface and be very, very good then, but we're going to have to see Shifter get banned or like not really playable in the format before that's the case. Next thing would be Ritual Beast. I like Ritual Beast. Shout out to Jonah. He put me on. I think these guys are really cool. I like Rampengu. He looks goated. Look at him. But this deck's really bad. It's really bad. It can play Shifter. That's the best thing about this deck. But major flaws of it, it cannot play Impulse. Someone at the Houston Regional was going around playing Impulse in their deck. I don't really know. I just saw it from behind him. I don't know if it was a cross-out target, but it blew my mind that they were attempting to do that. It's so bad. Your entire deck just doesn't function after you activate the card from hand. But I think that the main reason this deck is terrible is that it doesn't play through Parelia or Fuwalos at all. If you get Parelia or Fuwalos, your opponent's just supposed to like hold on to every card they draw until they get to like Imperm, and they just Imperm your Protoss, right? Because like that's your game plan, is that you get Fuwalos or Parelia and you just try to play as much as you can and then just Protoss and get Protoss to resolve. If you can get Protoss to resolve, you have a chance, but the fact they're going to be drawing like 6-7 cards and all they have to find is like one Imperm to stop it is so ridiculous that I really would not consider playing this deck. Kashtira, this is another deck that I've seen being played more and more. Don't know why. It's just one of those like mid-range decks that has a good Centurion matchup, I guess, but it has the same like ceiling as it did previously, which is just like a low ceiling. The board doesn't do much. You know, you're going to be ending with Unicorn Fender most of your time. Maybe you can get to a Heat Soul if you do like the Heat Soul combo, but even then, like your board's still weak. And like if this deck goes second, I don't really see this deck having that much gas. So personally, I would just leave this deck on my binder. I wouldn't even like take it out and test it. Yubel, I really like Yubel in this format. I think that it's better than Memento. Should be, yeah, about end of 2-2. I think it's better than Memento, but worse than Centurion. Yubel has the worst interaction into Fuwalos, I think. I think that's what's really killing the deck right now, because you don't have as many ways to play around it. Like, you can hard fuse from hand, and that's like your best counterplay to Fuwalos, because some people do wait, but against better players, they're going to shoot Fuwalos in the draw or standby phase. If you don't have Ash Blossom, Crossout, or Called By, it's kind of over. Right, you can still somewhat get to a board. If you have Beckoning Beast, you can get to Rage Escape with Yama in the graveyard with 2 draws. But let's be real. Even if you have 4 other hand traps in your hand, one of them is not Ash Blossom because you would have Ash Blossomed the Fuwalos. So even if you have like 3 Imperms and like an Effect Veiler or something like that, your opponent's breaking the board. They have 7 cards, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, and then they're gonna discard 1, draw 2 cards. And yeah, they're gonna have 7 cards to break your board. I'm telling you right now, if I play against Yubel and I'm playing Fire King, I have 7 cards in my hand. They're dead. They're gonna die really bad. Because that also leaves them with like no follow up, right? So I would be really hesitant to come across that situation. Besides that, the deck does have the highest ceiling out of any of the decks, right? The Yubel board is nearly unbreakable. The only issue is the Floodgate hand traps, which you're just going to have to deal with. This deck also doesn't have the best Tempai matchup. It doesn't have a bad one, right? You do have like cool interactions with Spirit floating around. I know some people are starting to cut the like Samurai guy from the Tempai extra deck because there's less Yubel. But still, I mean, they're prepared enough for it, even if they just have the Synchro 7 Moonlit Dragon, that I would be scared to play this deck. Moving on, we have the Voiceless Forest, or I'm sorry, the White Forest deck, Whitewoods deck. This deck's cool. There's two variations of it. There's the Runic version, and there is the Toy Box version. I personally think that the Runic version is no longer viable. I'm not a big fan of that deck, just because we're seeing so much Droll going around right now that the deck is almost unplayable. Right? You get Drolled in that deck, and it's just past turn. However, the Toy Box version does play around it a little bit better. You're able to at least get to your end board. If you're playing the deck very efficiently, you can even like get to the Synchro 8 before they're able to draw you, and then when they do draw you, you can trigger the Synchro 8 to summon a guy from the extra deck. Use the Diabell to summon a guy from the extra deck, which is going to get you even more advantage. This deck does have a good play through Fuwalos. It's Bagooska, right? So they use like a toy guy plus Sylvia, and they go into Sylvie, and they go into a Bagooska, right? And that's pretty hard to beat unless you draw into Imperm off of those like 2 draws, 1 draw they give you. So that is a game plan at least. The one issue that I have with this deck is that you have to draw both engines. If you don't draw Toy Engine and the Whitewood engine, you lose the game on the spot. Some people are playing the Azumina cards with it, which I think is cool. I think it definitely increases the ceiling of the deck. It helps the deck play through boards a little bit better. However, I don't really think it's that necessary to play. I don't know that many people will be doing it. But another issue with this deck is that it does have minimal non-engine slots, and you can't play Impulse, right? Because you're using late monsters. So that's something that I would be really, really careful of is playing this deck, just because it's got minimal non-engine. I'd probably put it in like a very, very high tier 3. Maybe better than Memento, actually. We could swap these around, I guess. Try to keep things even here. But I think this deck is okay. It does feel like if this deck loses that I roll, it's just cooked. It has no chance of winning. And then the last deck here is Mermail. This is a deck that a lot of people have been interested in. The OCG actually did not get to test this deck at full power. And the reason that I'm saying that is because they have Totally Awesome Band. That's a card that we have access to that they really don't. So Bahamut Shark wasn't really generating them a ton of resources, and that card is insane in the deck. Because you can make it with Dragoon, detach Dragoon, summon Totally Awesome, get Dragoon, search, and that's going to help you extend. So like not only are you setting up a board, but you're also searching for more extenders to help you play the game. I've talked with Aditya about this deck a little bit. I did shoot a message over to Pack to see like what he was really doing. He said that he was just free balling his combos, right? He's just playing his lines based on his hand. It doesn't have any set combos with it, which usually is not like a good or bad sign for a deck. But in this current format, having to free ball when you get Fuwalos or when you get Pirelia'd seems a little bit scary. I will say this deck does play through Fuwalos actually pretty well from what I've seen. You just try to hand rip them. So they discard 1 for the Fuwalos, and then you try to rip like 3 cards from them and set up like 1 or 2 disruptions. So that's like a cool line of play, I guess. I will say this deck it seems really cringe. It's like a go first turbo deck, but I do like that this deck has ability to play second. Like if you just look at the deck profiles, look at the combos, the deck obviously looks like it's just like a hard go first deck, which don't get me wrong, I think it is, but the deck does have some ability to break boards, especially with Minstrel in your hand, being able to snipe hand traps like Impulse, Ash Blossom, even like Droll out of your opponent's hand before you really commit to playing is really cool, and then going into the board is going to be really nice. I'd put this probably at the end of tier 2, maybe better than the White Forest deck, the Whitewoods deck. Yeah, this list honestly looks really good to me. I'd really love to know what you guys are thinking of this format. I'm going to leave the link to this in the description. That way you guys can do your own list if you want. Send it to me on Twitter. I'd love to look over it. Besides that, though, if you guys wouldn't mind like commenting and subscribing, I'd really appreciate it. And besides that, I just hope you guys have a fantastic day. Bye-bye.